Welcome to everyone to this lecture on how voters evaluate women candidates. So this event is co-organized by the research groups on governance, gender and rights at Christian Michelsen Institute, and the research group on democracy and development research at the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen. So we are really pleased to have Amanda Clayton with us today. Amanda is an assistant professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. At the moment, she's actually based at Uppsala University in Sweden. Her research concerns political institutions, representation and public policy with a focus on gender and politics. So Amanda has an impressive publication record. She has published in many of the top political science journals. Today she will give a presentation on co-authored work that she has done together with Ragnhild Murios, that is here, but also Amanda Robinson and Martha Johnson. And this research was recently published in Comparative Political Studies. Okay, so Amanda, the floor is yours. After your presentation, we'll open for Q&A.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for the chance to be here. I spent a month here as a PhD student, and it was really incredibly formative in my own research and working with my collaborators here, and I'm so happy to be back in this capacity. So today I'm going to talk to you about a project that is, yes, co-authored with Ragnhild, as well as Amanda Robinson and Martha Johnson, which we've called How Do Voters Discriminate Against Women Candidates? Experimental and Qualitative Evidence from Malawi. So I'll give you a brief outline of my presentation before getting into our hypotheses and what actually turned out to be very unexpected results. So we set out with the research question, how do voters evaluate women candidates in places where traditional gender norms are strong? So most of the research on candidate evaluations has come from the US, or at least most experimental research. And we thought, well, let's go to a place where gender norms are different. Of course, patriarchy exists everywhere, also in the US, but where there are different ideas about the conceptions of women's leadership, right? And our questions were twofold. First, do voters discriminate against women candidates in general, ceteris paribus? But then also, how do other salient candidate characteristics, such as political experience, family status, matrilineal versus patrilineal kinship practices, how do these other sorts of characteristics interact with candidate gender and how voters evaluate women candidates? So we used the case of Malawi's local council elections. So these are women running for local office in Malawi. Our data collection was threefold, and this is an important part of what we kind of use these three sources of data to triangulate very different findings. So the first is a conjoint-like survey experiment, which we did with 600 respondents. The second is biographical data on actual candidates in recent local council elections in the area where we did our survey experiment in that district. And the third was focus groups with actual men and women candidates who ran for local council, again, in the district where we did our survey experiment. And I'm going to preview our findings for you. So we actually find, really counter to our expectations, that voters prefer women candidates over men candidates, right? And they also evaluate men and women with the same traits similarly. So there's no double standard. And this was really kind of against what we were expecting. This evidence is from the conjoint survey experiment. But we also found two unexpected ways that women are disadvantaged in the electoral process. And these come from our other forms of data. So first, we find that voters prefer candidates who are married with young children. This comes from our survey experiment, right? We find a really strong preference for candidates, both men and women, who are married with young children. But in reality, this profile is much more common among men than among women candidates who actually run for office. So voters might evaluate men and women candidates similarly, but only the sorts of candidates that they like, those who are married with young children, they're present with men, they're not present with women. And second, this comes from our focus groups. We find pervasive reports of negative campaigning that likely affected voters' evaluations of real women candidates while not affecting their evaluations of the hypothetical women candidates that we presented in our survey experiment. So we kind of wanted to use this as a moment to reflect on experimental methodology and how it does or does not actually capture real electoral environments. So this is the summary. I'm going to walk you through our hypotheses, and it actually turned out that none of our pre-registered hypotheses were correct. So I won't spend too much time on these, but I'll what we expected to find, and then I'll show you what we actually found. So we thought that voters will exhibit biases against women candidates in the aggregate, so holding all else equal. And this is because, as in elsewhere around the world, and particularly in the global south, traditional gender norms are still quite strong, even though there is variation in this, which I'll talk about in terms of matrilineal versus patrilineal kinship practices. But this was informed in part by actually still strong explicit bias against women candidates. So in the most recent Afrobarometer data, 1 in 4 respondents either agreed or strongly agreed that men make better political leaders and should be elected rather than women. Right, so a quarter of respondents are willing to admit explicit preference for men candidates over women candidates, which made us think, okay, in our survey experiment, there will also be a preference for women candidates, all else equal. We also thought, so that's in general, but we also thought that other candidate features might interact with candidate gender as voters evaluated women. So the first was related to political experience. So we thought one thing that might explain gender biases is what economists call statistical discrimination, which is where you assume something about someone based on their ascriptive characteristics. And in particular, we thought the voters might assume that women are less qualified or less experienced than otherwise similar men candidates. Right? So if women have been historically marginalized, they do on average have less political experience than men. Right? So in the absence of other information, if people are evaluating a man versus a woman, they might assume the man has more experience. So an implication from this is that these biases then should go away if we inform voters that men and women have the same amount of experience, right? So if this is at play, then this should be kind of solved in our survey experiment if we tell people, no, actually, they're equally qualified, right? Second, we thought that voters might have biases that operated through a double standard in how they evaluate men and women candidates, particularly on this dimension of family. So we thought that citizens might penalize women candidates who are seen as abdicating societal caregiving expectations. We thought this could kind of happen in 2 ways that's reminiscent of the classic double bind that you might be familiar with. So first, when women are gender conforming, when they are married with young children, it might seem that they are neglecting their family responsibilities by going into politics, right, if they're expected to be doing work at home, right? So here they're conforming with expectations about what's proper behavior by being married with young children, but by entering politics, they're kind of deviating from that. But even when they are not conforming to these gendered expectations, so if they are single, if they are unmarried, if they have children who stay elsewhere, these sorts of things, then maybe they have the time for politics, but then they are not conforming with these societal expectations about proper gender behavior, right? So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. We thought this would be a double standard through which voters evaluated women candidates. So we created a condition. We thought, well, maybe women will be most successful when they are older, and perhaps particularly if they are widowed, so they don't have family obligations, they don't have young children in the home, but it's because of their life status rather than because of other things that are going on. Okay, and then finally, so Malawi offers a really interesting source of variation here. About 2/3 of Malawians belong to matrilineal ethnic groups. So this means that wealth is passed down through the mother's line, and they also practice matrilocality, which means that when a couple marries, they go to where the woman is from, the woman's village. And so we thought this was a really interesting source of variation, and there's been research by Amanda Robinson, our co-author here, and others that shows that women from matrilineal groups, both in Malawi and in sub-Saharan Africa broadly, do have higher levels of political participation. They have more influence in their communities. They have greater access to wealth. So we thought, okay, this might be an interesting way for us to test whether or not voters see women from these groups differently. So we thought the matrilineal women candidates, and we signaled this by last name, I'll show you this in a moment, they may experience less bias if they are perceived as more qualified because they have greater local influence, or as having more access to wealth, being better financed, kind of tying into the work on gender and electoral financing, right? If they have greater access to their family's resources. So these were all of our hypotheses. Again, the case is Malawi's local council elections. Women are very underrepresented in local government in Malawi. There are no gender quotas. This is a first past the post electoral system. In the last 2 elections, women held 8% and 12% of local council seats. In the most recent election, or actually the one that we're studying, women were 17% of candidates, but only 12% of winners, which means that there was definitely bias that happened in the electoral process. They weren't winning at the same rates that they were running, right? But these positions, they do have considerable de facto authority, not as much as some other decentralized governments, but still they're non-trivial roles, right? So their main responsibilities are soliciting funds for and overseeing local development projects and essential public services. So these are valuable positions. Okay, so I'll start with our survey experiment. We ran this with IPOR, the Institute of Public Opinion and Research, and we ran our survey experiment in Kasungu, Malawi, in one district. We had 600 respondents, and they indicated their level of support for 6 candidate profiles. So if you're familiar with conjoint survey experiments, often they'll have you choose between 2 profiles. So they'll say, which candidate would you prefer of the 2? Or it's often been used to talk about attitudes towards immigration. So like, which immigrant would you like to admit of the 2? We thought that would be too difficult because we had to read this aloud over the phone, and we thought reading 2 profiles and having people choose between the 2 would be difficult. So we just read one candidate profile and then asked the respondent to rate how much they supported the candidate. So I'll show you what that looked like. This was when we were pre-testing our survey experiment in the field. So you can see that our survey enumerator here, he's reading the candidate profile aloud over his phone, and then the respondent is telling him how much he supports this hypothetical candidate. So what the respondent heard was this, and what is bolded here, you can't see it too well, but the parts that are bolded are the things that we randomized, right? So the respondent would hear, this candidate is named Miss Martha Chisale, and she is 42 years old. She is standing on the MCP ticket. I should say this area was an MCP stronghold. This is the political party, so we didn't vary this at all. All candidates belonged to this political party. And her priority is building new boreholes in the ward. She has a secondary education, and she is a business owner. She is widowed with adult children. So a respondent would hear something like this, and then we'd ask them, how much do you support this candidate? A little bit, somewhat, a lot. We would also ask them, would you prefer to vote for this candidate over your current local counselor? These sorts of dependent variables. And what we randomized is contained here. So we wanted to include, you see here, 5 different sorts of variables. We wanted to mask our interest, which was really in gender, by including other characteristics as well, which is typical in conjoint sorts of designs, that you include many different characteristics, so it alleviates social desirability bias from any one sort of characteristic, right? So the candidate could either have a primary or secondary education. These are the values that are associated with that in Malawi. They either had a junior certificate or a certificate of education. Occupation, they could be a business owner, tobacco farmer, or teacher. Policy focus, we had some expectations here. We wanted to include policies that were both preferred by men and preferred by women on average, as well as one that was more gender neutral. So we rotate through these 4: maintaining roads, building new boreholes, ending child marriage, or improving local schools. Political experience, if you recall, we hypothesized that biases should erode once we tell people that they have political experience. So here what we did, which is a feature of conjoints, so some people got no information about political experience, and then some respondents got information that the candidate served on the area development committee. So we're able to see how respondents update their biases compared from no information to being told information about a candidate, right? And then family status, we have no information. So again, we can see what people's expectations are in the absence of information, and then we update them with these other characteristics. So they're either widowed with adult children, which we thought would be culturally appropriate, and also no family obligations. So our expectation was that women would fare the best in this condition. Married with young children, so culturally appropriate, but the woman has family obligations. And unmarried with young children staying elsewhere, which we thought would be culturally inappropriate, but then the woman has no family obligations. So these are the categories. These are randomized, right, for each of the different characteristics that the respondents saw on the survey. Okay, so these are our main results. And what these coefficients show, right, so this is if it crosses this center line, it means there's no effect. And these coefficients show comparing a man to a woman candidate, right? So on average, we see a slight but statistically significant preference for women candidates on average, right? We see that respondents also prefer candidates with a secondary education over a primary education, which makes sense. We see no difference in evaluations in terms of their career. We see that compared to no information, citizens prefer candidates who do have leadership experience, right? So that makes sense. We see for some reason in this area, people did not like candidates who prioritized boreholes. We didn't really theorize about why that might be, but you know. And then this is interesting. So this is on family status. So this is for both men and women, right? We see that there's no difference in terms of candidates who are married with small children. And this is compared to no information, right? So this means probably that people assumed that candidates were married with small children, right? They didn't change their evaluations when they were told this information, which means this was probably what they were assuming anyway, as it is the norm for most adults and local counselors in this area. But they did penalize people who were widowed with adult children somewhat, and they also really penalized people who were unmarried with small children, right? Actually, this is kind of our largest effect size. Yes, please.
So to interpret the coefficients, so the dependent variable seems to be a binary, let's say the statistic one. Are these coefficients or substantive effects? Because statistical significance is not necessarily substantive. The substance is basically how far to the left or the right it is, right? And then the confidence interval is whether or not that's how I'm judging statistical significance, right? So. Say something about the probability, different characteristics change the probability of supporting or not.
Yeah,
Could be the log of the observation, which is
it's about 5 percentage points. If we look at, so for instance, the coefficient from man to woman, if I recall, is about 5 percentage points. So to give you a sense, I don't recall off the top of my head what these other ones are. But yeah. But thanks, that's a good question for me to think about as we present these results. And then we see, interestingly, like patrilineal to matrilineal kinship, there is actually no difference. So contrary to our expectations. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you, these are just the general coefficients, right? And now what I'm going to show you is whether or not men and women are differentially judged, right? So we ran these same results for men and for women, and then this is the difference between the coefficients for men and for women, right? So if men are rewarded or if women are rewarded more for a particular characteristic. And actually you see that nothing is significant, right? So neither men nor women are awarded more for having a secondary education, for being a particular profession, for having leadership experience, prioritizing different things. This was surprising to us, right? There's no difference between a man who is unmarried with small children is also penalized, right? To the same degree that a woman who is unmarried with small children is penalized. So we see no evidence of a double standard. Okay, I'm going to turn to our other forms of data, unless there are any other questions before I move on.
What is your sample size?
So there's 600 respondents, and they're asked to evaluate 6 candidate profiles. So then we have about 3,600 or so actual observations. Mm-hmm.
Did you also have married with adult children as a characteristic?
We didn't. I think that would have been helpful. Yeah, we didn't, because we thought that widowed meant that the woman wouldn't have responsibilities to her husband, right? So we have widowed with adult children, but not married with adult children.
Because I see from those 3 alternatives,
Right. And I think that's what's going on is that people didn't like widows. I think that we didn't think that that was going to happen. Yeah. You'll see that there's, people accuse women of being witches and these sorts of things. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Sorry, can you just...
from urban area or local rural area was just scattered in both.
Yeah, good question.
Urbanization level, that is it included here or not?
Is what included? Sorry.
Is it here? In urban, rural, yeah.
Yeah, so we chose Kasungu district because they had both an urban council and a rural council. So there's actually like two councils. And so we have respondents both from urban areas and from rural areas. These results, I believe, I'm trying to recall, we don't get substantially different results if we include covariates in our estimation, right? Because it's randomized, but we see no difference actually between rural respondents and urban respondents, kind of interestingly. Yeah. Okay, so in Kasungu district, we ran the survey experiment. We also we originally did this because we wanted it to inform the sorts of categories that we were going to use on our survey experiment, but we ended up using this data for a different purpose. This is about half of the total candidates for the previous local council elections we were able to reach either in person or over the phone. And we asked them kind of basic demographic characteristics by trained local enumerators from IPOR. So we collected data on their age, their marital status, the number and ages of any children, their education, their prior occupations, and prior party involvement. And what we find is that on all of the variables, there is no difference between men and women except for on family status. So in terms of age, in terms of prior political experience, occupation, no differences between men and women, but very extreme differences in terms of family status. So we see that of all the men that we were able to contact, all of them were married, while only about half of the women were married. So I don't know what happened to their husbands. We can speculate. This is highly statistically significant. And also in terms of having young children in the home, so about half of the men had children under 5 in the home, while only 27% of the women did. This is just at the threshold for statistical significance. And children under 18 in the home, about half of the women did, but the majority of men, 86% of men did, right? And this is statistically significant. So the men by far are conforming with this kind of preferred candidate profile. They are married with young children at the home, whereas women are not, right? And we can speculate reasons why that might be. Okay, and we also did these focus groups. So we had 4 gender-segregated groups with 11 women and 10 men. This included both people who won and lost their elections from the 2014 elections. The sessions lasted about 2 hours. They were led by trained local facilitators, also from IPOR, usually held at schools. And what I'm going to focus on is we asked people kind of in non-gendered terms, but the sorts of discrimination that they experienced on the campaign trail, or if they did. And we found that all women candidates reported gender-specific almost all, reported gender-specific verbal abuse from their competitors. So the most common experience was being called a prostitute. This is a quote from one of the participants. She says, "We women were insulted very much by our opponents, especially on the issue of prostitution, especially as single women." Other experiences included being told their husbands would divorce them, being accused of sleeping around on the campaign trail, or being called witches. There were other kind of just really horrible things of women being teased about menstruating, just really bad gender-specific misogynistic abuse that these women experienced. And I will say that the women reported that these all really came from their competitors, so not from citizens, but from their male competitors, kind of slandering them. And one participant directly connected this rhetoric from their competitors to voter opinion, right? So she says, the result of women being insulted is that people doubt that person, right? So this is really different from these hypothetical candidates that we're showing people in the survey experiment, right? This woman is describing, all the women really described a campaign environment where kind of gossip and defamation made voters doubt them specifically, right? And I think that these kind of two forms of bias that I'm talking about, so this kind of qualitative reports of negative campaigning and also the fact that married women don't run, that these two things are plausibly related, right? So many women participants reported the fear of being slandered as a reason why women don't run for office. And this is actually from one of the men participants. He talks about how this affects married women specifically. He says, the women who could qualify to vie for the position of a counselor, you will find that she is often married, and for her to leave her husband and concentrate on politics, it becomes a challenge. As a result, we don't have many women vying for these positions, right? So that's kind of an interaction between this negative campaigning and the fact that then women who would be, that voters would like, according to our survey experiment, don't want to run out of fear of this sort of slander, right? Okay, and to kind of conclude, I want to talk about the problems in assuming that there are no bias from these sorts of experimental results, right? So we find pervasive reports of negative campaigning that likely affected voters' evaluations of actual women candidates who actually ran for election, but not affecting voters' evaluations of hypothetical women candidates, right? And as I said, right, the voters prefer married women with young children, but that women like this don't actually run. So voters aren't actually given the choice to choose between similarly qualified or similarly, similar candidates in general. And this is not from my study. This is from a different study, a recent working paper, a meta-analysis of 42 different factorial survey experiments on candidate gender. Most of these are in the US. Some, you'll see our Malawi study is here. But what they find is that on average, from these kind of conjoint-like experiments, voters do prefer women candidates on average, hypothetical women candidates on average. And this, they conclude in their paper, which I think is the wrong conclusion, they say these results strongly confirm the growing consensus that the underprovision of women in elected office is due more to supply-side factors than demand-side factors, right? So this idea that if women run, then they will win. It's just up to women to run more, to lean in, and that will kind of solve the problem of women's underrepresentation. And what I think is that our results really suggest that biases do operate, but they operate in a really kind of complicated way that is hard to measure experimentally, but is very real. So kind of what I want us to perhaps discuss, and one thing that I've been thinking about in lieu of our results, is can we do better experimentally? I mean, I am an experimentalist. I like to think about causes and effects and kind of clean identification strategies. But are there ways to design survey experiments to capture the way biases operate in real-world elections? It's possible that the answer to this is no, but I think that is kind of something that we need to consider before we draw conclusions from experimental results in the absence of other work or other sorts of data. And actually, I'll leave it at that. So thank you. Yeah, please. Oh,
Yeah.
do you want to field?
No, thank you so much, Amanda. We're open for Q&A now. So is it okay if we collect a few questions and then
Sure,
you
whatever you
respond? Okay, so Arne, Marianne, and Jana.
I have a query about the representativeness of your study, and it has to do with the sample. You draw a sample from 1 out of 28 districts in Malawi,
That's right.
and that district is dominated by one particular party.
Mm-hmm.
Although you bring in some other variables such as ethnicity and so on, but how does this affect the representativeness of your findings? If you had, let's say, 3 or 4 districts that you included in your study. I have some real big question marks about that. Thank you.
So,
Perhaps I can respond as they come up. I think that
yeah, okay, that's easier for you. That's fine.
So, obviously any study is resource constrained, so we could only go to one district. We chose Kasungu district because it had this interesting sort of variation that we were interested in. It had both an urban council and a rural council. It had both matrilineal and patrilineal groups living in the same geographic area, which is pretty rare in Malawi, as I'm sure you know, since it's pretty geographically clustered. So this was the reason why we wanted to go here. It is dominated by one political party. Experimentally, we keep that fixed, right? But I guess I'm not sure why it being a stronghold of the MCP would affect our results. Did you have some thoughts about that?
I don't know. I'm just asking the question. I don't know if different parties have different attitudes to the gender issue. And it could be that DPP has a very different view. I'm not quite sure about it, but I think it would be relevant to ask, and I would like you to reflect on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are no gender quotas in Malawi. No, I would say that the parties, and those who are Malawi experts can also speak on this, the parties generally have embraced the 50-50 campaign, which supports women candidates generally. I don't think there are, as I'm sure you know, political parties aren't really divided on this issue. It's not like we have liberal and conservative in the same way, where there might be some that are more supportive of gender equality versus those who aren't. And also it's a question, I guess, of whether or not a party's platform would be then reflected on voters. If MCP voters prefer women candidates more on average than other voters in other districts. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that is plausible, but I don't know. I guess I think that our findings really convincingly show that despite a preference for women candidates in this survey experiment, that women are still operating in this incredibly gendered context, which affects their election chances.
So, Jana?
Yeah, first of all, I would really like to thank you for a super interesting presentation and paper. So I read the paper, and I think it's a very nice example, especially how you make sense of findings that are contrary to expectations. I think I have a suggestion about future research and design, because I think so I did an observational study on electoral success in Irish local elections, and what I found was what really matters is name recognition, which means that most important is incumbency. Maybe family relations. And of course, this is very difficult to model experimentally, since you cannot really present known candidates. But very often voters don't really think about, is he or she married and so on, because they simply don't know it. But they do see a name and they are like, oh, I know that name. Maybe he or she is doing good work, so I'm going to vote for him or her. So I think that many of those results you were showing in on the before last slide can be explained by that, that you usually have high numbers and high shares of male incumbents, and that unless women have access to those incumbency advantages, they don't profit from this name recognition mechanism. So I don't know, maybe in kind of, a more complex experiment where you have some time in between, maybe you could do something like that, because I think that's really a very important mechanism that's not captured by hypothetical situations.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important point. I know that there is, I believe it's being fielded now, a survey experiment in Brazil that tries to, has similar sort of design and does manipulate the name of whether it's a dynastic name or not. I do think, though, this study has really convinced me that telling someone that someone is from a dynasty is very different from if they actually know the candidate and the person. So I think that maybe we should be moving more towards these sorts of qualitative, observational, self-reporting. But yeah, thanks.
Marianne?
Yeah, thank you for a very inspiring presentation. I was just wondering whether you have separated, or if you've registered any differences in the characteristics of the voters, because I would assume that maybe men and women voters react differently to these potential women candidates. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so there were 3 variables that we looked at in terms of voter characteristics. One was men and women. The second was urban versus rural. And then the third was members of matrilineal versus patrilineal ethnic groups themselves, so voters from those groups. And we actually don't find significant differences across these different groups. I think because we didn't find significant differences, we didn't really delve into it a lot of why that's happening. But it really seems that the main things that keep standing out over and over and over again is this slight preference for women candidates, and then this really strong dislike of both men and women who are unmarried with children that live elsewhere. Yeah.
Great. So now I have Carlo, Lisa, Matthew, and Sarah on my list. So we're going to start with Carlo.
And I feel like this paper is published, so I'm not like thinking about it all the time now. So actually, this isn't logistic regression.
Marginal effect. I looked in your paper actually. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
marginal effect.
Yeah.
So it's substantive outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for the presentation. I know it's always easy to criticize research designs after they have been implemented, since you guys put a lot of effort and thought into that. But since you asked suggestions on improving research design, I think with these vignette experiments, the problem is often that vignettes read a bit sterile, right? So these illustrations of cases where you vary different characteristics of, in this case, candidates, the assumption is that these traits arrive at the respondent. And I think this is further complicated in the context of a phone survey, right? Where you don't have, the interviewer doesn't really have a strong connection with the respondent, actually. So there is little observational control whether the manipulation really arrives and informs the outcome.
So these were face-to-face interviews. So
okay.
Yeah. So this is, for instance, this is the enumerator. He's reading it from the phone.
Because first I thought there were telephone interviews.
So that was how we collected the data from the actual candidates,
right.
the biographical data. Yeah.
A second point is I thought that the sample size is quite small, considering that you vary a lot of different traits, actually, right? And you look at subsamples and at different traits. So maybe you can say something about whether the statistical power is sufficient, because that could then also explain why you may not find that many effects on the variables that you were looking at. So one way, what I tried to do in survey experiments is to look at manipulation checks. So do these treatments that you insert actually really arrive, so that you can basically do after the treatment has been delivered, after actually you ask the respondent about your main outcome, right? Yeah. To see whether, what they remember from from the treatment. So that's a way actually to strengthen your the case that the treatment is really making a difference, right? Because that's what you want, right? You want the treatment to really make a difference in the type of support in your case.
Yeah, I'll just say two things on that. So first of all, do you want to finish? So we sampled 600 respondents, but they each are evaluating 6 different profiles. Yeah. So then that really massively increases our sample size, which is nice. So we actually basically then have 3,600 different observations. We have standard errors that are clustered at the respondent level, right? But that still gives us a lot more power. And I agree that having manipulation checks or attention checks are really helpful, but it's kind of difficult in this context exactly because of that reason. So if you said, here's this candidate profile, okay, do you remember if it was a man or a woman? Here's a candidate profile, do you remember if it was a man or a woman? Then they start to get tipped off quite quickly. But I have other survey experiments where they're just evaluating one vignette, and then we do ask them, of course, if they recall the main thing that we're interested in.
So one other way would also be to use video treatments instead of textual or statements that are read, right? So it makes a much more stronger impression maybe on the respondent. I thought that also maybe social desirability bias could affect the response behavior. So if there is, I don't know how salient, gender discourses are in Malawi, but sometimes they are, right? Because international actors implement a lot of gender-related programs. So men, women, they might be biased, or the effect might be confounded in a certain way. I mean, you shouldn't have a systematic effect because you took a random sample, but it could, lower the probability that someone really shares his true preference, actually. Yeah. One way to counter that would be, for instance, to use a list experiment to measure the outcome, right? So, or behavioral outcomes, signing a petition, donating, so that you get over the problem of political correctness bias.
Yeah, it's certainly an issue. And you suggested some ways. It's difficult in this sort of conjoint setup to do those sorts of things. it is possible. I mean, the people who did our survey enumerators were not Western researchers. They identified themselves as being from this Malawian research organization, which they are from, so that helps a little bit. Also, the thing about conjoint designs is they are supposed to mitigate social desirability bias to any given factor, right? Like the only way we cue gender is by the name, and then there's all these other characteristics as well. It doesn't totally get rid of the possibility that people think that it is correct to be supporting women candidates. But I will also say that, recall that a quarter of the population reported explicit preference for male candidates, right, from the Afrobarometer. So it doesn't seem like these norms have trickled down to the extent where people might feel shy about expressing a preference for men over women.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so could you pass it on to Lisa?
So first of all, I really just want to congratulate you on this paper, both to Ragnhild and Amanda in the room. First of all, because it's super important that papers like this are published, and it's a very, very transparent paper. It's very honest, and it's great for methods teaching. So I mean, I really just want to congratulate you, and it's like, so many times, the null findings or the negative findings don't get published. Mm-hmm. So I think this, I want to congratulate you for doing it and for CPS for publishing it. Yeah. So I think it's really brilliant. This for not least for this, for all of us, to see what are the limits, what can we do, and and potentially what can we do better, obviously. So. What I sort of missed, and so it's a comment and not a question. I'll try to be quick. I would love to see more work on the focus groups and the sort of more empirical findings from the actual interviews, because I thought that was incredibly and that was so interesting, and it was interesting that the sense is that this is coming from your competitors, but it's also how this clearly affects women not, for actually standing in politics. And we are living in a very sort of brutal political age. And I was just wondering, I really don't have an answer to how we can inform our experiments in this. But I'm thinking that some of Carla's suggestions, maybe, in terms of using video experiments, but I don't know. I mean, if there's time, I'd like to hear more about the focus groups and what are you thinking of doing more with this, and what can you use this data for? But mainly, it was just a congratulations, a superb paper that I learned a lot from.
Thank you. Thanks. The chapter in our hopefully forthcoming book will have more on the focus groups so
yeah, that's another reason for pushing this book.
Okay.
Tell Martha.
Okay.
So Matthew.
So I'm going to echo Lisa's congratulations on the paper and its publication. But the question I have, I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment or advice to, in the next round of presentations of this paper, to avoid, and it's, or to think about more systematically. And it's the point that the insults from your competitors make voters doubt the candidate, right? And this is completely counterintuitive to what I know about how the elections and the insults work in these places, right? It's less about the voter and casting doubt on the character of the candidate, because most of these candidates are well known within the communities, right? They're people who they interact with them on a daily basis, so they're integral parts of the community, and it's more about dampening the chances that the woman candidate will continue with her bid to run for office, right? It's about discouraging them from running. Yeah. Or if it's not about discouraging them from running, it's putting pressure on the family and the shame that her candidacy is putting on them, so that way the pressure comes from within the family for her to stand down, right? Yeah. So either in future iterations, it's either explain how this finding that the voter thinks of the voter starts doubting the character of the candidate, right? Differs from what we know about what these insults actually do, that it's less about the voter and more about disenfranchising or making the woman not stand for election.
Yeah. That is fascinating and a really good distinction. I'm really glad you brought that up. You're right that it is a strategy to keep women down, to not run. Look what happens when women run. Do you want someone from your family experiencing this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is going on, and I showed some quotes to that effect. That, but there were women who said that the result of all of this slander is that voters do begin to doubt the candidate. But it is then a question a little bit of, we could look and see if that was more likely to come from women winning versus losing candidates. It could be candidates who are more unknown that have this sort of experience, that they haven't already established like a clear reputation. Of course, it also depends on the district size. If the woman is really, or the candidates in general are really well known. But it's such a good point that this is like basically a strategy of the patriarchy to stop women from running in the first place, rather than about any particular election. Yeah.
Insults would actually help, right? So if it's about resources versus about, you mentioned something about the voters characterize them as witches, sluts and whores or whatever.
Yeah, it's more the latter. Like, it's really like personal attacks on their sexual impropriety. And if you read, so like Sylvia Tamale has talked about this in Uganda. I mean, this is, Eilidh Tripp has talked about it across the continent. I mean, this is a common thing that women candidates report having to experience. Whether or not the question, like you said, is if it's meant for voters or if it's meant as like a warning to women generally, is a good point, though. Yeah.
Okay, so I have Sarah on my list, and she's in the back.
Thank you also for the wonderful presentation and the great paper. I'm going to echo, I think, some of Lisa's comments, but perhaps a little more in depth. So I'm not a stats person. I'm not a Malawi specialist. I'm also not a voting specialist, so why am I here? But for me, what was the most interesting part was the move to the qualitative data and away from the quantitative, and thus both demonstrating some of the limits of the quantitative approach. But I guess my question is then, in that shift to more of the qualitative data and the analysis, have you found other studies that have explored the hypothetical versus the actual kind of female candidate? And out of, I guess, just selfish interest, have you seen this in the American context? Because this really does seem to be, at least anecdotally, like a driver of, how Hillary didn't get elected, or what's next for Kamala or for Elizabeth Warren or what have you. So I'm just wondering kind of what exists in the world of this line of inquiry and analysis that you have.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it totally explains women in U.S. politics, right? They'd have like, oh, sure, I like women. I just don't like that woman, right? And people don't realize that the reason why they don't like that woman is incredibly gendered, right? There hasn't been a lot of research on this in the U.S. comparing hypothetical to actual candidates. In fact, I think that's really like an area that there's a big lacuna in the research on this. One study that I saw recently at the European Conference on Politics and Gender, it was looking actually at Canadian elections, but what it did was it was a survey, just a regular survey, not an experiment, and it had people evaluate candidates running for local office. I think there are mayoral positions in I forget how many provinces, but a handful of candidates, or maybe like 20 candidates or so, and the men and the women, and it was just an open-ended response of tell us what you think about this candidate, and then from that they were able to, they used structural topic models to see if different themes emerge from the voters' descriptions of men versus women candidates totally inductively, right? And they do see, not surprisingly, that comments about women are much more gendered, of course, and there's also, there are instances of kind of extreme misogyny and sexism towards these women candidates, as we see in U.S. politics towards women too. That wasn't a huge portion of what people wrote, but enough where you could certainly think that it affects the electorate. But it's difficult then to think about how you kind of compare that to a survey experimental framework. So for instance, if people are saying, this woman running for mayor, she's kinder, she's really more focused on the community, the man is more aggressive, this or that. Are those stereotypes, which we might expect, or are they actually describing the way that the candidates actually act or comport? So that's a little bit the difficulty in comparing the hypothetical versus the experimental, but I think that it's I want to think about it more because I kind of want to move into that realm of how to compare the two. Thanks.
So, Magnus?
So I just wonder whether to make this more real world-like. So maybe in the next project you could randomize the framing. So you run an experiment like this, but then for a random sample, you have a different framing that make it more real world-like. So maybe show some video from the campaign trail that come up with these gender stereotypes that people.
Yeah.
Then see whether the weight you have on the different attributes, in particular gender, whether that will change.
Yeah, I think if we did, that would be the way to go. We'd have to really put a lot of thought into it to kind of make the treatment stick, as we've been talking about. So there would be like a rumor mongering condition where respondents hear about, but I also would have ethical qualms about like, saying that a woman candidate, the sorts of things that they say about these women, right? So I think that would be the way to do it, but it would take some work to do that well too, I think.
So it could be some real, from the field, something that people actually have seen, so they
get
reminded of it.
Right. Yep.
Torun. So just wait for the mic.
All right. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I'm wondering if there are some aspects of voter behavior that is not really captured by your study, and that is like a more relational way that voters decide which candidates to vote for. Because the way that you present it here, it's a bit like, okay, so here are the candidates, and we prefer this and this characteristics. But I don't know about Malawi, but in many countries it seems that there's a certain there's dynamics of loyalty and patronage. So voters would vote for a certain candidate because they'd expect this candidate to deliver benefits to the village. And then they would vote for a candidate that they perceive to have strong connections, ability to deliver resources. And very often that is a man and not a woman.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that can be captured in a kind of study like this.
Yeah, it can't really, right? Like we're looking at voter demand for women candidates, which is very different from the supply of women candidates who come forward, which is very much then conditioned by these sorts of things of like who is able to be a patron for their community, right? And of course the two interact. If people know that the real male candidate is much more likely to bring resources to community than the woman candidate. So no, I think that's kind of exactly what's kind of the problem with these sort of vignette experiments is that they aren't able to look at the way that men and women actually are in the real world. We're focusing on family status and differences between those, but I think that you're right. Also, voters, not their expectations about whether or not they bring in resources, but like actually whether or not there are men and women who are more central to the community, who are more connected to these sorts of networks. Of course, that matters hugely. And I think, again, then it's really problematic. How I concluded is that a lot of these survey experiments, authors conclude, well, if women just ran more, obviously there's no bias. Like, that's what they say. There's no bias. Look, these survey experiments show that voters actually prefer women. If women just ran more, then that would solve the problem, right? And I think the sort of things that you're talking about and what I'm talking about in a different context in terms of family, but in terms of patronage, et cetera, really means that there are severe ways that not only the pathway to office is gendered, but then how voters actually evaluate men and women in the real world.
So there's time for one final question. Anyone? No? So then I think we're going to end now. Thank you everyone so much for coming and for great comments and questions. And special thanks, of course, to Amanda for a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.